So this year is going to be a very, very, very big, like a huge election year, right? 2020 presidential election. Two candidates left. So we got current President Donald J. Trump, and then we have the presidential candidate, Joe Biden. Okay, so before we get into the conversation about the presidential candidate Joe Biden, I really want to make it clear that right now we're currently in June. Okay, we're a few months out from the presidential election, and then obviously we're quite a ways out from the inaugural, like the whole inauguration, the inaugural address, and all that, right? So it's right now is really the time to. Well, we should have obviously talking about it a long time ago, right? That shouldn't have been a question. We should have started talking about it months ago. But right now, it's really time to go full force into it, right? We really need to get the conversation, essentially jump started again, because we're so close to that big election, and we really need to. And I really truly feel like, you know, our mindset and our conversations have been essentially going away from the whole election season, right? Because obviously we had the whole coronavirus hit, right? Unfortunately, that did a lot of damage on a lot of things, right? And that's a major discussion point, right? And that's a topic point for another time, and it's something obviously we need to think about, okay? Because we essentially have really two big gifts, like that's it, right? Two big gifts, two big rights, two big freedoms that we have here in the United States that are extremely important, and I really have a value of, and it's the freedom to vote. Okay, as soon as we hit the 18-year-old mark, we're given that freedom to go out and vote for what we value in, which leads into that second point, which is the freedom of speech, right? And I really feel like those two freedoms perfectly tie hand in hand, and they really work beautifully, right? And here in the United States, we believe that they're just a God-given right, and which is I think is absolutely incredible. Okay, and I feel like nowadays, I feel like a lot of folks don't really value the freedom to vote, which is absolutely crazy because there's countries around the globe that are fighting, just for that right to vote. And yet here we are in the United States, and there's a lot of folks, especially, my age, and in their, you know, upper, from that 18-year-old point, essentially to that year old point, where they don't really value the freedom to vote. They don't really think twice about it. And what we don't really realize is, like, every vote matters, no matter whether we're voting in some kind of town election, or whether we're voting for something at a large scale value like the presidential election. So this is why I really want to start talking about this series. I really want to start this presidential series. It's because I really want to encourage folks to, not only use that freedom to vote. I really want to expand the freedom of voting, right? I really want to use this series as a way to try to promote it. I want to make sure people understand that this freedom of voting is essentially crucial to what makes the United States the United States. Okay, it's the ability to be able to go out to the polls, to be able to say, like, voice our opinion, to be able to say, hey, this is who I want to see in office. And it doesn't matter who, it does matter who you want in office, but the ability to go and say, this is who I want. I want this person to be in this particular office at this particular moment in time. That's like the most incredible thing we can get, I honestly think, here in the United States of America. And the freedom of speech, like, and it's one of those things again where we can see it all the time with everything that's going on around us here in our government, here in our local communities. to be able to go out, not only the polls, but to other places around us, and to be able to freely voice our opinions, and help try to influence, like, hey, I want this person in this particular situation, and so on and so forth, right? To be able to freely go out and voice our opinion and not get, because the thing is, in a lot of countries, a lot of folks are getting, in a lot of different countries around the globe, if somebody goes out and voices their opinion, like, that's like against the law in some countries, right? And so to have that freedom and that luxury here in the United States and not have to fight for it, that's honestly the most, like, right there. The freedom of voting, the freedom of speech are the two most incredible gifts, I think, that we get here in the United States. Okay, so this is why I really want to jumpstart and really start talking about this conversation. So by the time we get to the big election in November, we're ready to rock and roll, right? We're going full speed ahead, okay? And honestly, from here on out, it's going to be an extremely, extremely exciting time for the presidential election, okay? There's going to be a lot of great things going on, and there are, like, already some great things going on, right? President Trump just had, a big talk a couple of nights ago out in Oklahoma, which ended up being, I think, a pretty big success. I don't really know what Joe Biden's up to. Joe Biden's been pretty quiet lately. What has it been, like 80 days or something now? I have to look into that, because he either hasn't had some kind of talk in 80 days, or he's tried to have one, but not many people, like only a couple people went. You see, the thing is, Joe Biden's been pretty quiet for quite a long time, and been hanging out in his basement. But I really want to quickly talk about a couple points about Joe Biden, right? Because I want to take a few videos to not only talk about the overarching presidential events going on over the next few months, right? But I want to kind of dive in, a little deeper to both presidential candidates, right? So the big thing about this one will be presidential candidate Joe Biden, right? And Joe Biden has had, positions within the government for a long time, right? I mean, he's basically, made his career out of it, starting out in essentially the 70s, right? He went to college, got a couple degrees, and essentially in the law and governmental realm. And right away in the 70s, he started, as just as low as you can get, and then made the way up the ranks, in the Senate, and all of that stuff. Had some big roles in the Judicial Committee and some other committees as well. And what's interesting too is that he's actually made a few presidential runs in the past that haven't worked out well for him. One of the first ones that he had, I think it probably was the first one that he had back in the 80s, where Joe Biden was actually doing really well, right? He was raising a ton, like he had a ton of money. He was going to be the youngest president. If he became president, he would have been the youngest president to be since essentially John F. Kennedy. And so he had a lot going for him in that election, right? Up to that point, he had some great roles in the government. So he had that going for him, right? And then at that point, and then again, to reiterate, he was going to be the essentially the youngest president to be since JFK, like I just said. So he had, again, that going for him. And like I said, like I quickly touched upon a little while, just like a few minutes ago, he had a lot of people, donating to his campaign. He had a lot of fundraisers going on, where they were going really well. So he was one of the folks he was one of the very few folks that year that had a lot of money, like in the election campaign, right? So I'm pretty sure he was at the top. He was the number one wealthiest campaign in the year that they had it. So, essentially three major talking points that were going for Joe Biden. And, he had a lot of had a lot of talking points, but I think essentially the big thing for Joe Biden was that year was that he was I think he was struggling to campaign a little bit. He couldn't really, obviously he had a lot of good talking points, but he really couldn't keep, a strong debate going, and he couldn't really, like, over the course of time, he couldn't really, you know, keep the debates lively. He couldn't really keep his strong following. He couldn't really keep that strong following backing him, right? He had a lot of these, folks donating a lot of, like, tons and tons of money to his campaign, right? And he just lost interest in a lot of these folks, and they just didn't really feel confident in his ability to be able to debate these other candidates, as well as as well as having the ability to eventually become president, right? And so I'm pretty sure he tried once. Well, yeah, he did. He tried once more after that in 2008. And I kind of had a feeling that it was one of those deals where a lot of folks remembered what happened back, at his first, at his first whack at it back in the 80s, right? And so, again, it was one of those things where he couldn't keep a lot of interest in what he was trying to promote and what he was trying to accomplish. And so he was one of those guys where, unfortunately, he got knocked out somewhat early on. But what was interesting about Joe Biden was that, there was pretty, again, soon after he dropped out of the presidential running, right, he got the offer from Barack Obama. We all know Barack Obama, right? At least I hope so, because he was kind of the president, beginning in 2008, right? And then 2012, he got reelected again. So, pretty early after he dropped out of the race, he got the offer, an offer from Joe Biden. Joe Biden got the offer from Barack Obama saying, hey, if you want to be my vice president, I want to offer you the position. But what was interesting that because I was doing some reading on Joe Biden, he initially declined it, right? He was like, no, I don't want to do it. I was just going for president and nothing else. And it was interesting because, it was crazy. It was crazy too, because he thought that it was essentially going to downplay, like, getting the vice president position was going to downplay his whole career, especially within the Senate. Like, come on, like, the vice president is still a great position to have. Vice president, that's nothing to down talk about. Like, why would you think that? So, over time, I feel like Joe Biden really started thinking about it. It was like, oh, wait, what did I say? Like, it took him a while to realize that the vice president position is a very, very honorable position to have. And to have such a superior position in our government, like, that's an honorable thing to have, okay? And so I think over time, it just kind of kicked into him like, oh my goodness, what did I just tell Mr. Obama? Why did I just say that? I just basically kind of jumped the gun a little bit and really kind of ruined myself on that one. So once he realized that, Joe was like, okay, he had another meeting with Barack Obama and was like, hey, I spoke way too soon. I was way too confident. And hey, look, if you're still offering the vice presidency, I would more than gladly accept that offer, okay? And so obviously he, was given the position, right? And as soon as Barack Obama won, became the vice president of the United States. So, what's interesting about Joe Biden too, and I'll wrap this up in a few minutes because this is getting a little long for a video. So what's interesting about Joe Biden was that he's constantly just going and going and going a little more, right? he's definitely a guy that doesn't give up, right? Obviously, he's one of those guys that, you know, he is getting older. And this will lead into my point, right? So his first wife that he got married to, that's something I have to read into more a little bit, but got into some accident, and his wife and a couple of his daughters died. And so for a long time, it really kind of messed with Joe Biden. And eventually he kind of bounced back. He eventually got remarried. He had, again, had kids. He had a great job in the government. One of those things where, Joe Biden's been in the government for a long, long time, right? Going back to the 70s. And, hasn't really done a ton, right? He hasn't had such a lucrative list of a ton of things. He's done stuff. He's obviously done stuff, like a handful of things, right? But not as much as you would expect, for such a long and luxurious government career. And he has had a couple like a brain surgeries, right? Like I was reading, he has had a couple of brain aneurysms. And so it's just crazy to see that with everything going on with Joe Biden, good and bad, he just keeps fighting, right? He just keeps on going and going and going. So, this election year will be a very big election for Joe Biden. To see what he has left in his bag of goodies, right? You'll see what he has in store for his ability to debate, because we obviously all know that that's the thing that really got to Joe Biden the most, was his inability to be able to debate on the presidential dance floor, right? On the presidential scale. And so Joe Biden, if he really wants to become president of the United States, he's really got to go after it, okay? He's really got to put a lot more effort out than he might be used to might be used to, right? But it's one of those things where I feel like if Joe Biden really wants the presidential election, he really has to try for it, and maybe he will get it. Because I know here in Massachusetts and here in essentially New England, it's a very big Democratic area, right? I live in Massachusetts, so I know that Massachusetts is a very big Democratic state, and I know it's a pretty similar demographic for New England and the general Northeast. Okay, so that's my little quick wrap on Joe Biden. And again, the presidential election this year is going to be a great election to follow. Okay, so make sure, as soon as all these, the President Trump has already started up again his presidential campaign again with what happened back in Oklahoma. I thought it was a great speech, by the way. I loved it. I thought it was the greatest thing ever. So this was the Joe Biden shindig. Okay, in the next video I come out with will be about not only the presidential candidate, but current President Donald J. Trump. Okay, so make sure you go subscribe to my channel. Make sure you watch all my videos, and make sure you watch my next video on President Donald J. Trump. All right, I'll see you soon.